In chess, you are constantly capturing pieces and making trades on the chessboard. But how do you know if you should capture or trade? Obviously, the queen is the most valuable piece, but what about the other pieces? Fortunately, there is an easy way to evaluate trades based on a numerical value for the pieces. Let's take a look. Each pawn is worth 1. You can think of this as $1 if it helps. The knights are worth 3, and the bishops are worth 3. So basically, the knights and bishops are the same, though in many positions, bishops are better, and in some positions, knights are better. Rooks are worth 5 points, and queens are worth 9. Well, what about the king? It's worth the whole game. Let's review that. Pawns are worth 1, knights are worth 3, bishops are also worth 3, rooks are worth 5, and the queen is worth 9. Let's take a look at a few positions and decide whether it is a good or bad idea to trade pieces. In this position, does white have any trades? Yes, white could trade a rook for a queen. Is this a good trade? Absolutely. This is a great trade for white. White gave up a 5-point piece, the rook, for a 9-point piece, the queen. White gained 4 points from that trade. In this position, white has the chance to trade a rook for a knight. Is this a good trade? White gives up a 5-point piece, capturing a 3-point piece. It's not such a good trade. White loses 2 points out of that trade. Let's take a look at one more position. In this position, white can play rook takes d8, trading a rook for a rook. Is this a good trade? An even trade isn't bad. And let's say the bishop recaptures, offering a bishop trade. And another even trade happens, bishop for bishop. After all of these trades, white did not win any material. Both sides traded 1 rook and 1 bishop each. Notice white was up a pawn before all these trades happened, so white's position is still pretty good. But was there a better way white could have handled this position? Let's take a look. When you have a chance to capture or trade pieces, remember to look at all of your options first. Was rook takes d8 white's only option to trade pieces? Look at white's bishop. White could have played bishop takes d8. White trades a bishop worth 3 points for a rook worth 5 points. Remember, it is usually a good idea to capture with your least valuable piece first. Let's say black recaptures with the rook. White now has the chance to trade rooks, 5 points for 5 points. Is this a good trade for white? You might think it's just even, but remember this idea. When you are ahead in material, it's good to trade pieces. When you are behind in material, you should avoid trades and keep the position complicated. Since white is up material, this is a good idea to trade rooks. White now has a much better endgame. White is up a rook for a bishop and has an extra pawn. Now that you've learned the value of the pieces, let's see if you can use these values to decide whether or not to trade pieces. Chess is a game of strategy where you have to make plans to win, but it is also a game of tactics. Strategies are the longer-term ideas and goals, and tactics are the short-term, immediate moves you can use to gain the advantage. You will learn about many different kinds of chess tactics, moves that directly help you win material, or even deliver checkmate. But the simplest one of all is the hanging piece. A hanging piece is another word for a free piece. It's a piece hanging out all by itself, unprotected, and available to be captured for free. Obviously, you can't base an entire strategy on capturing hanging pieces, but you can sure benefit from the tactics of finding hanging pieces. Let's take a look at some examples together. In this position, it's white to move. Can you find any unprotected pieces in black's camp? The rook on a8 is unprotected. It's all alone. When you find an unprotected piece, the next step is to see if it's a hanging piece, and the way to know that is if there's another piece that can just capture that piece. So in this position, can one of white's pieces capture the rook on a8? Yes, the queen. The rook is completely hanging. White wins the rook for free. In this position, black notices that white has two unprotected pieces, the rook on d2 and the knight on a3. So black decides to attack both of those pieces at once with the queen. One way to avoid hanging pieces is to always ask before making a move, is the square I plan to move to a safe square, or can something capture my piece on that square? Black didn't ask that question and didn't realize that white's queen was already protecting the a5 square. Black's queen is hanging. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, white is ready to promote the pawn currently on b7 into a queen on the very next move. And since there's nothing on the back rank, white's expecting a back rank checkmate. Unfortunately for white, white's in for a surprise. After promoting, now the queen is checking the black king, and white is expecting the rook to retreat, and in this case, the queen would just take the rook, and it would be a back rank checkmate. However, is there something protecting the b8 square? Look at that. The bishop was protecting the promotion square. White's queen was completely hanging. Now that you've learned how to look for your opponent's hanging pieces and avoid hanging your own pieces, it's your turn to practice taking advantage of hanging pieces. In this position, white is attacking the pawn on d5, but black is also defending that pawn. So how do we know if capturing the pawn on d5 is a good idea for white? Let's count. Usually you want to have at least one more attacker than your opponent has defenders. Notice white has two attackers, the rook on d3 and the bishop on f3. Black, on the other hand, only has one defender, the rook on d8. Since white has one more attacker than black has defenders, white will make the first and the last capture, usually a good sign for the attacker. White makes the first capture with rook takes d5, capturing black's pawn. Black captures white's rook with rook takes d5. So far, white has only captured a pawn and black has captured a rook, but white gets the final capture with bishop takes d5, capturing black's rook. Notice that both sides captured a rook, but white also captured a pawn, meaning white won a pawn from the captures thanks to having one more attacker than black had a defender. Let's take a look at another position. In this position, notice that white has two attackers against black's pawn on d5, the rook on d4 and the bishop on f3. Black, however, has two defenders, the rook on d8 and the bishop on e6. So there's two attackers against two defenders. When there is the same number of attackers and defenders, the defense usually has the advantage. The reason why is that although the attacker captures first, the defense captures last. Let's see this idea in action. After bishop takes d5, white captures first, taking the pawn on d5, so white is currently up a pawn. Let's keep track of all the captures as we go along. Black captures white's bishop with rook takes d5. So black has captured a bishop and white only a pawn. After rook takes d5, white captures the black rook. So white has now captured a rook and a pawn, and black has only captured a bishop. White is in the lead for now, but black gets the last capture with bishop takes d5, capturing white's rook. Let's review the captures. Black captured a bishop and a rook, and white captured a pawn and a rook. Since both sides captured a rook, they cancel each other out, and we see what's left. Black captured a bishop, and white captured a pawn. This means black won a bishop for a pawn. Since two attackers did not succeed against two defenders, white needs to add one more attacker to the d5 pawn. Can you see how white can do this? That's right, knight to c3. White now has three attackers against two defenders. Black would like to add a third defender to keep the balance between attackers versus defenders, but Black cannot add a third defender on the next move. So Black plays knight to g6, dreaming of playing knight e7 on the next turn in order to add that third defender to the d5 pawn. White should not allow this to happen and should capture the d5 pawn right away. Does it matter which way White captures? It sure does. When you decide to capture, it's a good idea not to capture with your most valuable attacking piece first. Since the bishop and knight are both worth 3 points, the 5-point piece, the rook, should not capture first. Why? Because after rook takes d5, Black is able to trade White's most valuable attacker for Black's least valuable defender, the bishop. So after bishop takes d5 and knight takes d5, notice that Black captured White's rook and White captured a bishop and a pawn. Black gained 5 points and White only gained 4 from these trades. This means Black got the better deal from the captures. Since capturing with the most valuable attacking piece lost material for White, White should capture with the least valuable attacking piece first. The least valuable attacking pieces are the knight and the bishop, so either capture would be fine. Let's capture with the bishop first. After bishop takes d5, White makes the first capture, gaining a pawn. Black captures White's bishop with bishop takes d5. Black is currently up a bishop for a pawn, but White gets the next capture. In this position, White could capture with the least valuable piece again with knight takes d5, and it would be a good choice. But notice that White can also decide to play rook takes d5, capturing with the most valuable piece. Why is it okay to take with the most valuable piece now, but it wasn't good a move before? The reason why is that Black's only remaining defensive piece is the rook, which is as valuable as White's rook. You do not want to capture with the most valuable piece when your opponent can capture with a less valuable piece, such as in the last example where White lost a rook for a bishop. After rook takes d5, Black captures White's rook, and now White makes the final capture with knight takes d5, capturing Black's rook. Both sides captured a rook as well as a bishop, but White also captured a pawn, so White won a pawn by counting carefully and making the right moves. Let's take a look at one more position together. Is it always true that when there are an equal number of defenders against attackers, that the defense will get the better deal from the captures? Not always. In this position, White has 2 attackers against f7, the knight on g5 and the bishop on c4. Black has 2 defenders, the queen on e7 and the king on e8. White captures a pawn with knight takes f7. If Black takes the knight, the queen must make the first capture because the king would put itself into check by capturing the knight. Since the queen is worth more than both of White's attackers, the knight and the bishop, Black will lose material after queen takes f7, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7. White captured a queen and a pawn worth 10 points for a bishop and a knight worth 6 points, so White gained 4 points from the captures. Counting is a very useful idea, but remember not to blindly follow the counting method. You always have to think carefully with each position. Now that you've learned the importance of counting, it's time to practice counting captures to your advantage. One of the most powerful tactics in chess is the fork. It's another way of describing a double attack where you are attacking 2 or more pieces at the same time with one piece. The most notorious of all forks are those done by the tricky knights. Let's take a look. In this position, white appears to be in serious trouble. White is down a significant amount of material, but the game isn't over yet. If white's knight could somehow attack the king and queen at the same time, the game would turn completely around. In this case, knight e7 check saves the game for white. It forks the king with check and attacks the queen. So once the king moves, white is able to win the queen. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, white can fork not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 pieces all at the same time with the move knight e7 check. This move is known as a family fork because the knight forks the entire family of black pieces. Now that the king has escaped check, which piece should the knight capture? Capturing either of the rooks is fine, but the best move is to win the queen. So far, we've only looked at knight forks. They sure are fun, aren't they? Well, it turns out other pieces can deliver forks or double attacks as well. In this position, white has great control of the center, with 2 pawns already placed in the middle of it. Notice the pawn on e4 can march forward, advancing into black's territory. What would happen then? White creates a pawn fork. Remember, forks are most effective when you attack 2 greater valued pieces with a less valued piece. In this case, the pawn attacks the greater valued bishop and knight at the same time. When one moves, the pawn will capture the other piece. For example, when the bishop moves, the pawn captures the knight. And after the pawn is recaptured, white gains a knight for a pawn using a fork tactic. Finally, in this position, white has a queen versus a rook. This isn't the easiest endgame to win, but in this position, white's in luck. White can win black's rook by using a fork. Can you see how white can check the black king and attack the unprotected rook at the same time? That's right, queen to d1 check, checking the black king and attacking the unprotected rook on a4. After the king moves, say king to c7, white wins the rook with queen takes a4. Now that you've learned the power of the double attack known as the fork, it's your turn to practice using the fork tactic. Another of the most important tactics in chess is the pin. Imagine a pin being stuck into a piece and through the board, making it impossible to move. The pin is used to freeze other pieces and to win material. Sometimes in chess, we say win material as a way of describing a series of exchanges where you come out on top. There are 2 types of pins. The first is the absolute pin. In this example, the knight on e2 is pinned to this square because if it tries to move, notice the black rook would be able to take white's king, which is completely illegal. Because the knight cannot move, this also means the queen on d4 doesn't have any protection. black can simply capture the queen, and again, white cannot recapture because the knight is absolutely pinned. In this position, the pawn on c7 is pinned by the bishop on a5. Notice the pawn could move, but then the bishop would be able to take the queen. We call this a relative pin. Even though you technically can move the pawn, you wouldn't want to. In this last example, after white plays knight takes c6, black makes the terrible decision to play queen takes c6, recapturing the knight with the queen, but lining the queen up with the king. So white can now play bishop to b5, pinning the queen to the king. Notice the queen would like to leave this diagonal, but it cannot. It's absolutely pinned. And if the queen tries taking the bishop, then the knight would simply take the queen. White will surely win material by using this beautiful tactic of the pin. Let's see you try it out. One of the best parts of a pin is that the pin piece cannot move. This often gives the attacker an extra move to make the pin even worse. If a piece is pinned, you don't have to capture it right away. If you remember the lesson on counting attackers and defenders, you'll know that it's important to keep adding attackers to outnumber the defenders. Let's take a look at some examples together. In this position, black's rook is pinned to the king, so black brings the king closer in order to protect the rook. Notice that the rook is still pinned. How can white pile on more pressure to the pinned piece? That's right, push the pawn. White now has two attackers against the rook, so black's king cannot recapture when the rook is captured. Notice if white would have captured the rook before adding the pawn to the attack, white would have lost the advantage, but now white gets to keep the bishop. White simply wins the rook. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, white's knight is pinned to the queen. How can black pile on more pressure to the pinned piece? That's right, with the knight. Knight to d4. Now white will lose the knight because if white recaptures with the queen, black will take the queen as well. Now that you've learned the importance of piling up on pinned pieces, it's your turn to increase the pressure against pinned pieces. While a pin is a tactic which pins a piece into place and prevents it from moving, a skewer is the exact opposite. With a skewer, the piece being attacked is so important it must get out of the way, leaving a vulnerable piece behind it. The worst is a king and queen skewer. In this position, notice white's king and queen are lined up on the same diagonal. This should set off some alarm bells. Now the black bishop can move to f6, putting the king into check. Obviously the king must move, but when this happens, the queen gets captured. This is a classic skewer. Let's look at another example. In this position, black's queen and rook are lined up on the same diagonal. Can you find white's best move here? That's correct. Bishop to g3, skewering the queen to the rook. The queen removes itself from that diagonal, but leaves the rook wide open for capture. White wins an entire rook, thanks to the skewer. Skewers don't have to be on diagonals. They can also be on ranks. In this position, can you find a rook check that skewers the black king to the knight? The correct move here is rook to g7, and after the king moves, white wins the knight. The key to finding a skewer is recognizing when valuable pieces are lined up together. Now it's your turn to find some skewers. It's always nice to capture an opponent's piece for free, or win material from a good trade. In many positions, you will have several options to trade pieces, but a lot of these choices can be bad. Being able to avoid making bad trades is essential for chess improvement. In this position, white has 4 options to trade, but 3 of the captures are bad. White can play knight takes b5, rook takes d6, or rook takes e6. In all 3 cases, white is trading a more valuable piece for a less valuable piece, losing material in the process. Can you find the one good trade in the position for white? Did you notice white's powerful bishop on g2 pointing at the rook on a8? After bishop takes a8 and rook takes a8, white has traded black's more valuable rook for the less valuable bishop, so white has gained material and made a good trade. Let's take a look at some other examples of avoiding bad trades. In this position, with black to move, black should focus on completing development with knight f6 and castling. Instead, black notices a tempting check and plays bishop takes f2 check. Black trades a bishop for a pawn, generally a very bad trade, hoping to set up an attack against white's king. After king takes f2, white's king has lost the right to castle, but as we'll see, white's king safety issues are short-lived, and black will simply be down material. After knight f6, black develops a piece and hopes to deliver a check with knight g4. White is not afraid of this check and plays the strong move rook f1. White prepares to bring the king to safety, so after knight g4 check, White can play king g1. White's king is basically castled, as it is protected by 2 pawns. White's rook will enjoy the open f-file once the knight on f3 moves. Black is simply down a piece and will regret trading a bishop for 1 pawn in a couple of pointless checks. In this position, both sides have started to bring their pieces into the game and develop. White should focus on developing the kingside pieces and prepare to castle. One trade that is generally bad is trading one of your developed pieces for an opponent's undeveloped piece. Notice that White can capture Black's knight with bishop takes b8. Even though the bishop and knight are worth the same, it would be a mistake to play bishop takes b8, because after rook takes b8, notice that White only has 2 pawns developed, and the rest of White's pieces are still on the back rank. Black now has a lead in development, so this opening is not going well for White. In this position, White can trade a bishop for a knight with bishop takes c6. Just because you can trade doesn't mean that you should. In general, you should only trade if it improves your position or makes your opponent's position worse. White shouldn't waste time with this trade. A better idea is to continue to develop and bring the king to safety with castles. If Black plays a6, attacking White's bishop, should White trade the bishop for Black's knight on c6? White should keep the bishop on the board and play either bishop c4, putting pressure on Black's weak f7 square, or play bishop a4, keeping pressure on Black's knight. It would be a mistake to play bishop takes c6. Notice that Black's knight on e7 is blocking the bishop on f8, so after knight takes c6, White traded a developed piece, improved Black's knight that was on e7, and has now opened up a path for Black's bishop on f8 to develop. Since this trade made White's position worse and improved Black's position, this was a bad trade for White. Let's look at one more example together. We already mentioned that trading one of your developed pieces for an undeveloped piece is typically not a good idea. Does this mean that it is always a bad idea? Not always. If you have a good reason to make a trade, don't be afraid to do it. In this position, Black could play bishop b4, developing a piece and checking the White king. White doesn't want to move the king, and blocking with the queen would be a very bad idea. But notice that White can block the check by placing the knight on d2 or c3. What if White couldn't block the check with the knight? Black trades the strong bishop on f5 for the undeveloped knight with bishop takes b1. After White captures with the rook or the queen, let's say queen takes b1. Now Black can play bishop b4 check. White's king is forced to run, so after king d1, and Black castles, Black's king safely finds shelter behind 3 pawns. White's king, on the other hand, is stuck in the middle of the board and may be a target for a future attack. Now that you've learned how to avoid making bad trades, it's time to put your skills to the test.